I'm Francis Kwame Nyamekeh, graduate student at the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, and I'll be presenting on Lynn White, the medieval Judeo-Christian philosophy, and the ecologic crisis. Lynn White's contribution towards nature and ethics generally have stimulated religious attitudes towards nature after the late 1970s. I have decided to examine one of his works, titled The Historical Roots of the Ecologic Crisis, where he argues that the Judeo-Christian doctrine of creation was the root cause of our current ecologic crisis. I will demonstrate that his attempt to trace that cause fails to consider a cosmological worldview, which would later inform a mechanistic view of nature. I offer an alternative reading to this Judeo-Christian doctrine of creation, and I maintain that that doctrine itself is fraught with some tension because it seems to both support and reject preservation of nature. This is somewhat an outline of Lynn White's argument. In one of his premises, he argues that man has been in charge of treating nature unkindly, and that kind of treatment was facilitated by an influx of sophisticated technology, and early modern science, he thinks, was somewhat a remote cause of this development of technology, which should imply that, or which you can infer early modern science is actually the real cause of this unkind treatment. But he moves further to say that early modern science is deeply motivated by a natural theological spirit of the Middle Ages. And here, by modern science, he refers to these Cartesian, Hobbesian, Lockean, Francis Bacon, Newtonian program or conception of science. Lynn White moves forward to talk about natural theology as being grounded in the Judeo-Christian doctrine of creation. It means like early modern science borrows the creation story to inform their natural theological spirit and later the growth of science and technology. And the Judeo-Christian doctrine was only the motivation, right? So first of all, natural theology was grounded in the Judeo-Christian doctrine. The Judeo-Christian doctrine was the only motivation for early modern science. Hence, the Judeo-Christian doctrine of creation was and is the root cause of the current ecological crisis. I would avoid explaining the first two premises because they are evident. In our world today, we found a lot of indiscriminate bush burning, indiscriminate pollution, be it sound, be it air, be it water. It's evident in our global warming and greenhouse effects, rise in ocean tides, etc. These are effects of a cause of an untreatment or an unkind treatment of nature. So I would discuss the conclusion that early modern science is the cause. I found this in Caroline Merchant's book, The Death of Nature, where she discusses a set of early modern philosophers like Francis Bacon, William Harvey, René Descartes, Thomas Hobbes, and Isaac Newton, who have seen the world as a machine that ought to be exploited. And if you can remember Cartesian philosophy of mind, where he thinks of the body as inert, as inactive without a soul, and active only when there's a soul in the body. And Hobbes having this physicalist view of the world, thinking of the world in physicalist terms. Locke and Isaac Newton developed a corpuscular view of theory of matter, etc. They all saw these things as a way of mastering and managing the earth. They didn't see the earth as something to keep and protect, but to master, to see yourself as a dominant figure. And this has a very strong tie to the creation story, and it's so evident why Lynn White believes that the creation story is actually in charge of that program. Lynn White moves forward to talk about early modern science as merely motivated by natural theological spirit. Right, so it's clear natural theology is just a way of studying nature and seeing nature as a gift from God that ought to be studied, having a very religious attitude towards nature, not to an extent of protecting it, but to understand its secrets and its pitfalls, its secrets, in short. Yeah. So from the 13th century onwards, including Leibniz and Newton, every major scientist, in effect, explained his motivations in religious terms. You find it in Locke's theory of a treatise of two governments, where he talks about God giving us reason to exploit the earth. His theory of property is grounded in both reason and has a religious spirit behind it. The Christian dogma of creation, which is found in the first clause of all the creeds, has a meaning for our comprehension of today's ecological crisis. By revelation, God had given man the Bible, the book of Scripture. Since God had made nature, nature must also reveal the divine mentality. The religious attitude for better understanding God was known as natural theology. Right. But this attitude towards understanding the secret, understanding nature, is deeply entrenched in the creation story, where it says that God had created Adam, and as an afterthought, he created Eve to keep man from being lonely. Man was made to name all the animals and thereby establishing dominance. It's very important. And God planned all that this explicitly were for man's benefit and not for man's protection. Man wasn't to protect, but man was to benefit from. And for Lynn White sees this clause as highly mechanistic, highly natural theological, like in the same way the Newtonian and then the Lockean spirit thought about enduring and then cultivating and then digging to understand the secrets of the universe. Lynn White believes that it was highly motivated by this clause, and hence the Judeo-Christian doctrine of creation is actually the root cause of the crisis, and not no other doctrine, be it Jewish, be it Islam, be it animistic. I think that would be very dangerous. But he saw Judeo-Christian doctrine to be the source of all this mechanistic thinking. So here's my response. My response is mainly historical, and I took a quotation from Lovejoy to clearly explain my view. So Lovejoy, who puts it succinctly, says that all had equal claim to existence. One species of being was never to seek its utility over the other, but this implication conflicted with an old assumption that all things created being existed for man's sake. So there was actually some tension in this Neoplatonic, Middle Augustinian great chain of being, Aquinas kind of great chain of being. So Aristotle developed a structure, a scalar natural, an order of how the universe is in some order of importance, right? And furthermore, they also thought of the universe as non-anthropocentric, that we're all know to see ourselves as a source of utility for another, but we know how to take advantage of another. Right? So there's already some tension in the doctrine itself, right? And I think Lovejoy fails to note this. So this further brings me to my main point, that Lynn White fails to distinguish, first of all, between this mechanistic thinking, seeing the universe as a machine, from an organistic thinking of the universe, seeing the universe as an organ, right, or as a body that has several organs, of which all organs ought to be equal enough. Right. So I further move on to my point about this organistic thinking. Where can we find this organistic thinking in the Judeo-Christian doctrine of creation? I would trace it back to the Platonic and Aristotle's geocentric view, further the Ptolemaic view of nature, right? So prior to the scientific revolution, which led to the development of sophisticated technology, the Roman Catholic Church controlled Western Europe and most of it. And with the Pope as its head, the Catholic Church was supported by the Ptolemaic view of the world, which saw the Earth as lying in the center of the universe. On this worldview, I think some comments can be made. Since it was geocentric, having the Earth at the center, the Earth was the most relevant of all planets. Intrinsic value then was conferred onto the Earth, whilst all other planets were cherished based on their contributions to the development of the Earth. But unfortunately, this geocentric view was essentially paganistic. I mean, Aristotle held that view, Claudius Ptolemy also held that view. But we can see that the church fathers had very strong attachments to these scholars. For example, Thomas Aquinas, who heavily borrowed Aristotelian metaphysics and the Judeo-Christian faith-based doctrine. Augustine of Hippo also borrowed a lot of new Platonists, like from Plotinus and a host of them, who held similar views about the universe. In Plato's Timaeus, for example, Plato likened the cosmos to be like an animal with a soul. The soul was the female part and oversaw all the natural laws and governance of all other natural objects. Providing the soul to the universe was an intelligent move to protect it from man's exploitation. Aristotle also held a similar view. In his theory of human generation, he saw the Earth as female rather. He didn't see the female as a soul, but the Earth itself. And the celestial bodies were the heavens. They had the semen, and then there was an impregnation, and the natural objects sprouted from these things, right? So the whole point here is that they saw the cosmos as an organ. And if you've done Platonic and Aristotelian metaphysics, you realize that they often ascribe rational souls to things that have intrinsic worth, even if, be it a slave, be it anything. Once they ascribe a rational part to it, they saw it as part of the society. And even when Aristotle argues for slavery and he ascribes souls to human beings, like, he still sees them value, but value that serves as like not an intrinsic one, but is more or less like a non or an instrumental value to its master, right? Yeah, but in any case, this is not to support slavery in any case, but I think that giving an entity a soul grants it more value than seeing it as an inert object, like Descartes thought of the body. So since the views were not anthropocentric, what was valuable didn't emerge from humans, but from nature itself, because nature was the one that was the organ, and nature was the one that created humans and other things. So someone can object that, for example, the human body has an appendix which is very futile and useless, and so not all organs of an organ system are important than other organs, or some organs can be more important, in short, than other organs. But I think that is very deleterious. Thinking of the appendix, for example, I think a very faulty one would be very dangerous to the human system. If it's not faulty, it has no real impact until it's become faulty. So yeah, the point is that we were to give them equal treatment, treat them equally. Not that because one doesn't show any sign of danger, you maltreat it to the benefit of another. Right. The merchant also argues in The Death of Nature that as long as the earth was considered alive and sensitive, it could be considered a breach of ethical behavior to carry out destructive acts against it. All these arguments seem to portray a non-anthropocentric value emerged from the earth. Humans didn't confer the value like the traditional reading of the creation story presents itself, that a man named, therefore enhanced or facilitated dominance. This time, nature was the one that granted value. So value was from perhaps like anything that had life, not anything that just had a mind. everything for these Platonists and Aristotelians was more or less animistic in some sense. Yeah. But Lynn White could think of these arguments as very porous. In fact, she could decide to, or he could decide, to take this mechanistic and organistic conception together and still make a case, right? For example, by relying on that X force so could be a way of thinking from a contradiction, anything matters. But I think we don't want to trade off validity for the soundness of an argument. Secondly, Lynn White can also reject my non-anthropocentric view of the creation doctrine or the Judaeo-Christian doctrine, and think of it as me merely stretching the logic of the ancients, because as I mentioned early on, giving a human being a soul doesn't make it any important. And I think on a very lighter note, comparing slavery to just dividing or destroying the whole environment, even though slavery is no lesser evil, I think both of them are really important. And in fact, without the environment, we can't even talk about slavery. So I think we ought to protect. I see the environment as very important. Without an environment, you can't even talk about human beings living and enduring slavery, right? So I think I'm not really overstretching that logic of slavery as seeing the soul merely giving them a soul doesn't really give them any value. I think it does. Even if it makes them slaves, it makes them way better than some other things. Yeah. So Lynn White can decide to destroy a distinction between a pre-Copernican thesis and a traditional thesis. Traditional thesis will argue that we'll take the real Ptolemaic view of nature, having this organistic, or we can have a pre-Copernican thesis that argues that we can have a mechanistic view within the doctrine, the church. And it's been argued by some scholars. Libel, for example, has argued that there was one cardinal who was preaching a lot of Copernicus mechanistic thinking of the environment. And I think that is wrong, because there's also a counter evidence that until the 16th century, no one in Latin West had seriously and systematically questioned Ptolemy's views. So it's just faulty to think of there being a cardinal who was systematically doing it. And in fact, if he's doing it, doesn't even mean the church accepted it. He could have been doing it in secret. A second argument that can be made against my view, or a second pre-Copernican thesis, can also arise from, or for example, Mortzich has argued that they didn't see the views of Ptolemy or of Copernicus, who later came to systematically present his views. They didn't see these views prior to Copernicus's invention. They didn't see anyone challenging Ptolemy. To be precise, they saw him improving Ptolemy's work. So the church was actually in charge of the whole spread of the doctrine. In fact, the church tolerated it, and the tension wasn't between empirical science and religion, but rather different views of the church leaders themselves about how to interpret the scripture. And I think that's possible, right? We can think of that kind of situation, that the church was even confused, and hence the church couldn't find it very difficult coming out with a very systematic view of nature, right? And hence they supported a mechanistic view. But for example, I think the use of contraceptives there's been a thorn in the church, the Catholic Church, for example. And for the fact that some church leaders support it doesn't make it anything. Doesn't make it a bad thing for the church. The church is it's written clearly that it's against it. So for the fact that some members of the church have tolerated those viewpoints, for the fact that some part of it has said, okay, we are interested, doesn't mean the whole part is in tandem with the views that some of them have decided to use. Yeah. So in any case, if Lynn White adopts this viewpoint, I don't think he can be successful enough. Thank you very much.